Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little unexpected for a bedtime tale. The entire history of opium in the Middle Ages, a forgotten painkiller that carried medieval civilization through its darkest hours of agony and disease. Forget the modern crisis headlines and contemporary drug wars. The real story didn't start in Victorian opium dens or colonial trade disputes. It began in monastery gardens, battlefield surgery tents, and the careful hands of Arab physicians preserving ancient knowledge while Europe slept through the Dark Ages. The truth is, dropped into a plague-ravaged medieval city or a Crusader battlefield, you'd learn fast that pain relief isn't a luxury, it's survival. And opium, for all its dangers, often proved to be the thin, precious margin between unbearable suffering and merciful rest. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications. Take a deep breath and let's begin. Picture a Roman army surgeon in the year 70, somewhere near the dusty borders of the empire. His name is Dioscorides, and he's watching a soldier die. Not quickly, not cleanly. The man's leg is shattered, the bone visible through torn flesh, and the screaming hasn't stopped for hours. There are no proper painkillers in the modern sense. No morphine drip, no epidural. Just a small dark cake of dried poppy latex that Dioscorides keeps wrapped in linen inside his medical chest. He dissolves a portion in wine. The soldier drinks. Within minutes, something remarkable happens. The screaming fades to shallow breathing. The twisted face relaxes. The eyes go distant, but not dead. It's not a cure, but it's mercy, and in the brutal calculus of ancient battlefield medicine, mercy is worth documenting. Dioscorides would go on to write the Materia Medica, 5 volumes describing over 600 plants and their medical uses. Opium occupied a special place in that text. He called it the juice of the poppy, Myconian in Greek, and he wrote with the precision of a man who had seen it work and seen it kill. Too little, and the patients suffered needlessly. Too much, and they never woke up. The line between relief and death was thinner than most people wanted to admit. But here's what matters for our story. That text, those 5 volumes, would become the foundation of medieval medicine. For the next 1,500 years, physicians across 3 continents would consult Dioscorides when they needed to understand plants, poisons, and pain. His observations about opium, written in the blood and dust of Roman military campaigns, would guide medieval doctors who had never seen a battlefield but faced suffering just as real. Dioscorides didn't invent opium use. Not even close. The Sumerians had been cultivating poppies since at least 3400 BCE, calling them whole gill, which translates roughly to joy plant. That's not poetic license. That's what they actually called it, recorded on clay tablets that survived millennia. The Egyptians took it further. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to 1500 BCE, lists opium among remedies for crying children and various painful conditions. Imagine being an ancient Egyptian physician, watching a child writhe with some unnamed illness, knowing you had something that could stop the crying, but also knowing it could stop their breathing if you miscalculated. The Greeks inherited this knowledge and systematized it. Hippocrates, writing around 400 BCE, mentioned opium for treating what he called women's diseases and for inducing sleep. He understood something crucial that would echo through medieval practice. He wrote that the physician must be ready to relieve pain, but also ready to do nothing when nothing could help. Opium fit into both categories. It relieved. It also obscured. Sometimes it let patients die comfortably when dying was inevitable. But it was Galen, the most influential physician in history, who truly shaped how medieval Europe would understand opium. Born in 129 CE in Pergamon, Galen served as physician to gladiators before becoming doctor to Roman emperors. He saw violence up close. Sore cuts, crush injuries, infections that turned strong men into screaming, delirious wrecks. He prescribed opium frequently, documented its effects meticulously, and developed theriac, a compound medication that would haunt medieval pharmacy for 1,000 years. Theriac was supposed to be a universal antidote, a cure-all that protected against poisons and treated dozens of ailments. The recipe was absurdly complex. 64 ingredients in some versions. Viper flesh, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, dozens of herbs whose names meant nothing to most people. The preparation took months. The aged compound was worth more than gold by weight. And it probably worked, mostly because of the opium, though Galen would have argued it was the precise balance of all ingredients that mattered. Here's what medieval physicians inherited from Galen. They inherited the idea that opium was powerful but needed to be balanced with other substances. They inherited detailed dosing instructions based on the theory of humors, the ancient belief that health meant balancing 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Opium was classified as cold and dry in the 4th degree, the strongest category. It cooled excessive heat. It dried excessive moisture. It made theoretical sense in a medical system built on balance. They also inherited Galen's warnings. He knew opium killed. He knew it created dependency. He wrote about patients who could no longer sleep without it, who needed larger doses over time, who suffered terribly when they tried to stop. Medieval doctors would rediscover these truths over and over, each generation learning through experience what ancient texts tried to tell them. But then Rome fell. The empire that had unified the Mediterranean world and spread medical knowledge across 3 continents collapsed into successor kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than preserving libraries. The great medical schools closed or diminished. Latin remained the language of learning, but fewer people could read it well, and even fewer had access to the complete texts. In Western Europe, knowledge retreated into monasteries. Benedictine monks, following rules established in the 6th century, took on the duty of caring for the sick. They copied medical texts by candlelight. They grew medicinal herbs in walled gardens. They preserved what they could of ancient learning, including information about opium. But their access to the actual substance became limited and expensive. Opium had to travel from the eastern Mediterranean through Byzantine territories, then overland or by ship to Western Europe. Every middleman added cost. Every border crossing added risk. What had been merely expensive in Roman times became nearly unaffordable in the early medieval period. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something that would ultimately save and expand all that ancient knowledge about opium. In the 7th century, a new religion exploded out of Arabia. Islam unified vast territories under a single banner and, crucially, under a culture that valued learning. The early Islamic caliphates didn't just conquer. They collected. They translated. They built libraries that dwarfed anything in contemporary Western Europe. Baghdad became the intellectual center of the world. The House of Wisdom, established in the 8th century, gathered scholars from across the known world. They translated Greek medical texts into Arabic. Dioscorides, Galen, Hippocrates. But they didn't just translate. They questioned. They tested. They added observations from Persian medicine, from Indian medicine, from their own clinical experience. And they had access to opium. The Islamic world controlled the primary opium-producing regions. The substance that was rare and expensive in Western Europe flowed relatively freely in the markets of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. Muslim physicians could experiment, could refine techniques, could develop new preparations that Roman doctors had never imagined. 2 men, more than any others, would define how medieval Europe eventually understood opium. One was Persian, born in 865 in the city of Ray. His name was Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes. The other was also Persian, born in 980 near Bokhara. His full name was Abu Ali al-Huzn ibn Abd Allah ibn Sina, but history remembers him as Avicenna. Rhazes ran hospitals. He wrote over 200 books. He documented diseases with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. And he wrote extensively about opium, noting not just its uses but its dangers. He observed that children who received opium regularly seemed to develop a need for it. He saw adults whose hands shook and whose bodies ached when they stopped taking it. He was describing addiction 600 years before anyone in Europe would use that word. But it was Avicenna who would truly bridge the ancient and medieval worlds. His Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025, became the single most influential medical text of the entire medieval period. It was encyclopedic. It was systematic. It was brilliant. And it devoted careful attention to opium. Avicenna described opium's effects with clinical precision. He noted that it stopped pain, induced sleep, controlled diarrhea, and suppressed coughs. He also noted that it killed in excessive doses, that it clouded thinking, that it created dependency. He provided dosing guidelines based on careful observation rather than just ancient theory. This was knowledge born from watching patients, from adjusting treatments, from learning what worked and what killed. The canon would be translated into Latin in the 12th century. It would be printed dozens of times after the invention of the printing press. Medical schools from Toledo to Prague would use it as a textbook into the 17th century. When medieval European physicians prescribed opium, they were following guidelines written by a Persian polymath who had died before the First Crusade began. Which brings us to the knife's edge, where ancient knowledge met medieval reality. By the year 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, two different medical traditions existed side by side. Western Europe had fragments of ancient learning, preserved in monasteries, limited by expense and isolation. The Islamic world had that same ancient learning plus 5 centuries of innovation, clinical observation, and relatively easy access to opium itself. The Crusades would smash these worlds together. European knights would ride east seeking Jerusalem and glory. What they would bring back, along with relics and scars, was knowledge. Knowledge about medicine. Knowledge about pain. Knowledge about a dark resin made from poppy sap that could transform suffering into something bearable. But that transformation came with a price. Medieval Europe was about to rediscover what the Romans knew, what the Greeks suspected, what Avicenna had documented. Opium could heal, but it could also enslave. It could ease death, but could also cause it. It was medicine and poison in the same dark cake, and the difference came down to dose, circumstance, and something nobody in the Middle Ages could quite name, but everyone learned to fear. The knowledge was about to flow west again, carried on the backs of warriors and in the minds of physicians, and medieval Europe would never be the same. The year is 1096, and a Frankish knight named Raymond of Toulouse is learning what combat actually means. Not the romanticized version sung about in halls, but the version where your sword arm is shattered and the bone is pushing through skin and the pain is so absolute that you can't form words anymore, just sounds. He's in a field hospital outside Antioch, surrounded by other men whose bodies have been opened in ways bodies shouldn't open. And there's a physician standing over him. Not a European physician. An Arab doctor who was captured, or who stayed, or who simply recognized that suffering doesn't care about religion. The physician has a small clay jar. Inside is a dark paste that smells faintly sweet, faintly bitter, faintly of something Raymond's pain-scrambled mind can't quite place. The doctor dissolves a measure of it in wine, speaks words Raymond doesn't understand, and helps him drink. Within minutes, the screaming in Raymond's arm becomes distant, like it's happening to someone else in another room. He can still feel it, but it no longer owns him. His breathing steadies. His jaw unclenches. For the first time since the mace connected with his arm, he can think. This is how knowledge transfers. Not through books alone, though books matter. Not through formal instruction, though that helps. Knowledge transfers when a European surgeon watches an Arab physician work and realizes their methods are better. When a Crusader survives a wound that should have killed him and tells others about the strange medicine that made the pain bearable. When Christian and Muslim doctors, despite fighting a religious war, share techniques because some things matter more than politics. The Crusades were supposed to be about reclaiming Jerusalem. They became, among many other things, a brutal intensive course in comparative medicine. European physicians who traveled east encountered a medical tradition that had spent 5 centuries refining techniques the Romans barely started. They saw hospitals that were cleaner, more organized, better supplied. They saw surgical instruments they'd never imagined. They saw physicians who washed their hands before surgery, who understood that cleanliness somehow prevented infection, even if they didn't understand why, who used opium with a precision European doctors couldn't match. And they saw opium itself, in quantities that were unthinkable back home. The Islamic world controlled the opium trade. Poppies grew in territories from Anatolia through Persia. The harvest was systematic. The processing was refined. Arab and Persian merchants had established trade routes that moved opium as reliably as they moved silk or spices. What cost a fortune in Paris or London was merely expensive in Damascus or Cairo. Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known to Crusaders and later medieval scholars as Rhazes, had died in 925, but his influence saturated Islamic medicine. His texts circulated widely. His observations about opium informed how physicians across the Muslim world used the substance. He had written that opium was useful for severe pain, for persistent diarrhea, for insomnia when nothing else worked. But he had also written warnings that European doctors were only beginning to understand. Rhazes had documented something he called habit. He noticed that patients who took opium regularly seemed to need it. Not just want it, need it. He saw wealthy patients whose physicians had prescribed opium for chronic pain and who now couldn't sleep without it, couldn't eat without it, couldn't function when they tried to stop. He saw the shaking, the sweating, the profound distress that came when regular users suddenly had no access. He didn't have words like addiction or withdrawal, but he described them with clinical precision that wouldn't be improved upon for centuries. More importantly, Rhazes had written about children. He noted that giving opium to infants, a common practice for quieting crying babies, seemed to create problems later. Some children became listless. Some stopped eating well. Some, he suspected, became dependent before they could even speak. This observation would be lost and rediscovered multiple times throughout the medieval period, each generation learning the hard way what Rhazes tried to teach. But it was Avicenna whose work would truly reshape European medicine. His canon of medicine was a masterwork of organization and clinical observation. He structured medical knowledge systematically. Diseases, symptoms, treatments, all cross-referenced and logical. The section on opium was remarkably detailed. He described its preparation, from scoring poppy pods to collecting the latex to drying it into transportable cakes. He explained different methods of administration. Dissolve in wine for drinking. Mixed with other substances for pills. Even prepared as suppositories for patients who couldn't keep anything down. Avicenna understood dosing in ways that saved lives. He wrote that dose should vary based on the patient's size, age, and condition. A dose safe for a large man recovering from surgery might kill a frail, elderly woman. He noted that opium's effects varied, depending on what else the patient had consumed. Wine intensified opium's power. Certain foods seemed to change how quickly it worked. This was pharmacology before the word existed, built on observation rather than theory. He also wrote about opium's dark side with unflinching honesty. Excessive doses caused death. The signs were specific. Extreme drowsiness leading to unconsciousness. Breathing that became shallow then stopped. Pupils that shrank to pinpoints. Cold, clammy skin. Avicenna described treatments for overdose that actually worked. Forced the patient to vomit immediately if they just ingested the opium. Keep them moving, don't let them sleep. Give them strong coffee or other stimulants. Pour cold water over them. It was crude but effective, assuming someone recognized the overdose quickly enough. The canon was completed around 1025. The First Crusade launched in 1096. For decades, these two realities existed separately. Islamic physicians in the East had access to Avicenna's insights and could apply them with relatively abundant opium supplies. European physicians in the West had fragments of ancient Roman knowledge and very expensive, very limited access to the substance itself. Then came the translation movement. Starting in the 11th century and accelerating through the 12th, European scholars began translating Arabic texts into Latin. They worked primarily in Spain, in the parts that had been reconquered for Muslim rule, but retained large Arabic-speaking populations. They worked in Sicily, another crossroads where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars could collaborate. They worked in Italy, in cities like Salerno where medical schools were hungry for new knowledge. Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who moved to Toledo in 1144 specifically to access Arabic manuscripts, translated over 70 works from Arabic to Latin. Among them was the canon. Suddenly, Avicenna's systematic approach to medicine, including his detailed opium knowledge, became accessible to European physicians. Not immediately, not universally. Medical texts were expensive even after translation. They existed in limited copies. But the knowledge started spreading, moving through universities, being discussed and debated and gradually adopted. The Islamic medical tradition didn't just preserve ancient knowledge. It transformed it. Consider what Arab and Persian physicians did with theriac, that ancient compound Galen had created. Roman theriac was complex, but Islamic physicians made it baroque. They experimented with different ingredient ratios. They developed regional variations. Baghdad theriac was slightly different from Cairo theriac, was different from Damascus theriac. Each city's physicians claimed their version was superior, and the competition drove innovation. More importantly, Islamic physicians developed new opium preparations the Romans never attempted. They created opium pills, carefully measured doses wrapped in wafer-thin bread or dissolvable coatings. They made opium syrups, the substance dissolved in concentrated sugar solutions that masked the bitter taste. They experimented with combining opium with other pain-relieving substances, trying to enhance benefits while reducing dangers. They didn't always succeed, but the systematic experimentation represented a scientific approach that Western Europe wouldn't match for centuries. The Crusader states, those unstable Christian kingdoms carved out of the Levant, became strange zones of cultural exchange despite the violence. In Acre, in Tyre, in Jerusalem, when Christians held it, you could find European merchants trading with Arab merchants, European physicians consulting with Muslim and Jewish colleagues, knowledge flowing in all directions. An Italian merchant recovering from dysentery might be treated with opium preparation techniques developed in Persia. A Muslim physician might learn about European surgical tools and incorporate them into his practice. Consider the Hospitallers, the Knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. They started as a religious order running a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem. They evolved into a military order that also maintained hospitals and employed physicians. Their hospitals in the Crusader states hired doctors regardless of religion, because competence mattered more than faith when people were dying. These hospitaller physicians, moving between East and West, became vectors for medical knowledge transfer. One hospitaller physician, whose name wasn't preserved but whose work was documented in hospital records from Acre, described treating over 200 battle casualties during a siege in 1281. He wrote that without opium, most of the wounded would have died from shock, the body's catastrophic response to severe pain and injury. With opium, carefully dosed, many survived the initial trauma and had a chance at recovery. He also noted that some of those survivors became dependent on opium and struggled for months after their wounds healed. This physician wrote something that European medicine was just beginning to understand. He noted that pain itself could kill, not directly, but through what it did to the body. Severe pain caused rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, inability to eat or drink, and eventually a kind of collapse where the body simply gave up. Opium interrupted that cascade. It didn't heal wounds, but it prevented pain from finishing what weapon started. This understanding, common in Islamic medicine, was revolutionary for European doctors still working primarily from ancient texts. The translators faced challenges beyond just language. Arabic medical terminology had evolved to describe things Latin had no words for. Concepts from Persian medicine, from Indian medicine, from centuries of Islamic clinical observation, all needed to be rendered into Latin in ways that made sense to European readers. Sometimes translators succeeded brilliantly. Sometimes they failed, creating confusion that took generations to untangle. Consider the word addiction. It wouldn't enter medical vocabulary until much later, but Arabic had multiple terms for different aspects of what we now call substance dependence. There were words for the compulsive seeking of a substance, different words for the body's physical need versus the mind's craving, words for the suffering that came when regular users stopped. All of this got compressed into inadequate Latin terms like habit or custom, losing precision in translation. But the core knowledge came through. European physicians reading translated Avicenna learned that opium was powerful medicine that demanded respect. They learned dosing guidelines more sophisticated than anything in earlier Latin texts. They learned to recognize overdose and had specific treatments rather than just prayers. They learned that regular use created problems beyond the original condition being treated. More importantly, they learned a systematic approach to medicine. Avicenna didn't just list remedies. He explained diagnostic principles. He described how to observe patients carefully, how to track symptoms over time, how to adjust treatments based on response. This methodology, applied to opium as to everything else, meant European physicians could start developing their own observations rather than just repeating ancient authorities. The Crusades ended badly for the Crusaders. Acre, the last major Christian stronghold, fell in 1291. The Crusader states collapsed. European armies limped home, having achieved little of lasting political value. But they brought knowledge. They brought surgical techniques. They brought an understanding of hospital organization. They brought familiarity with opium as a practical medicine rather than an expensive rarity reserved for the dying. They also brought something less tangible, but equally important. They brought the understanding that the Islamic world possessed medical knowledge superior, in many ways, to their own. This was humbling for European Christians who had assumed their civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement. But humility opened doors. It made European physicians willing to learn from translated Arabic texts. It made universities hungry for more translations. It created a cultural moment where ancient knowledge preserved and enhanced by Islamic scholars could flow back into Europe and transform medieval medicine. By 1300, any European physician with proper training had access to information about opium that would have astonished his counterpart 2 centuries earlier. He could consult Dioscorides, the ancient foundation. He could study Galen, the Roman systematizer, and he could read Avicenna, the medieval synthesizer who had taken everything before him and added 5 centuries of Islamic medical innovation. The theoretical framework came from the Greeks. The clinical observations came from the Muslims. The desperate need came from European patients suffering from pain that had no other answer. What happened next was quintessentially medieval. This knowledge didn't spread uniformly. It didn't transform practice overnight. Instead, it entered a complex world of universities and monasteries, of urban physicians and rural healers, of expensive imported medicines and local herbal alternatives. Opium's story in medieval Europe became a story about access, about cost, about who controlled knowledge and who controlled supply. It became a story about monks growing poppies in walled gardens and Italian merchants dominating the import trade. It became a story about the gap between what medicine knew how to do and what most patients could actually afford. The stage was set. The knowledge existed. The substance, though expensive, was available. Medieval Europe now faced the same questions that had confronted ancient Rome and the Islamic world. How do you balance opium's power to relieve suffering against its power to create new suffering? How do you ensure it remains medicine rather than becoming poison? How do you make it accessible to those who desperately need it while preventing abuse by those who don't? Nobody had good answers, but they would spend the next 3 centuries trying to figure it out, one patient, one dose, one difficult decision at a time. The year is 1243, and a physician named John of St. Amand is standing in his apothecary shop in Paris, staring at a problem that could kill someone. On his wooden workbench sits a dark, a regular cake of dried opium that arrived 3 weeks ago from Venice. It cost him more than most craftsmen earn in a month. A wealthy merchant's wife is upstairs in his consultation room, writhing with pain from a kidney stone that won't pass. She needs relief. He has the means to provide it. But the question keeping him frozen at his bench isn't whether to give her opium. It's how much. The cake weighs approximately 2 ounces, but its potency is unknown. Different batches varied wildly depending on where the poppies grew, when they were harvested, how the latex was processed, how long it had been stored. One batch might require a dose the size of a pea to bring relief. Another batch, from the same supplier, might need twice that. Give too little, and the patient suffered needlessly while the expensive medicine was wasted. Give too much, and she might never wake up. There was no way to test it except on a patient, and every patient was an experiment with potentially fatal results. This was the brutal reality of medieval pharmacology. Physicians had inherited brilliant theoretical frameworks from the Greeks and Arabs. They had detailed texts explaining what opium should do and how it should be dosed. But theory and reality were separated by a chasm of practical uncertainty that killed people regularly enough that every experienced physician had made the calculation that haunted John's thoughts. How many deaths from inadequate pain relief versus how many deaths from accidental overdose equaled acceptable practice? John of Saint-Amand was one of the most respected physicians in Paris, trained at the university, fluent in Latin and familiar with the major medical authorities. He had read Dioscorides in translation. He owned a copy of significant portions of Avicenna's canon, an extraordinarily expensive acquisition that marked him as a serious scholar. He understood humoral theory as well as any man alive, and he was terrified of the substance on his bench because understanding theory didn't prevent practical disasters. Medieval medicine operated on the principle of balance. The body contained 4 humors, 4 fundamental fluids whose proportions determine health. Blood, hot and moist. Phlegm, cold and moist. Yellow bile, hot and dry. Black bile, cold and dry. Disease resulted from imbalance. Treatment meant restoring proper proportions. Every substance, every food, every medicine was classified according to how it affected these humors. Opium was cold and dry in the 4th degree. The classification system ran from 1st degree, mildly affecting humors, to 4th degree, powerfully transforming them. 4th degree was the strongest category, reserved for substances that could radically alter the body's balance. This meant opium was understood as extremely powerful medicine that should be used cautiously and only when necessary. The theory was elegant. The practice was messy. Consider what cold and dry actually meant in practical terms. Medieval physicians believed that pain often resulted from excessive heat in the affected area. A throbbing wound was hot. A pounding headache involved heat rising to the brain. Severe menstrual cramps came from hot blood. Opium, being cold, would cool this excessive heat and thereby reduce pain. The drying quality explained other effects. Diarrhea involved excessive moisture in the intestines. Opium dried that moisture, stopping the flux. A runny nose from a cold involved too much phlegm, and opium would dry it up. This seems absurd now, but it worked as a predictive framework. If you believed opium cooled and dried, you could predict it would help hot, moist conditions and potentially worsen cold, dry ones. A patient with watery diarrhea and fever, hot and moist imbalances, was a good candidate for opium. A patient already cold and weak might be harmed by opium's additional cooling effect. The theory wasn't scientifically accurate, but it gave physicians a systematic way to think about when to use opium and when to avoid it. The problem was dosing. Medieval texts provided guidelines, but the units of measurement were inconsistent and the substance itself was variable. Avicenna recommended doses measured in grains, but a grain of what? Different translators used different standards. Some texts recommended a dose the size of a lentil, but lentils come in different sizes. Others suggested the weight of 2 barley corns, which was slightly more specific, but still left enormous room for variation. John of Saint-Amand, staring at his opium cake, had to make a decision based on incomplete information. He knew the woman upstairs weighed perhaps 9 stone and was in her 4th decade of life. He knew kidney stone pain was severe enough to justify opium. He knew she had eaten recently, which might slow the opium's effects. He didn't know this batch's potency. He didn't know if she had any individual sensitivity that might make her react more strongly than expected. He didn't know if the wine he would dissolve it in would enhance or moderate its power. He cut a piece roughly the size of a chickpea, approximately 5 grains by the standard he had learned at university. He dissolved it in strong red wine, which the text said made opium work faster and more reliably. He went upstairs, explained the treatment, and watched her drink. Then he waited, because waiting was part of the physician's art. Opium didn't work instantly. It took time, sometimes a quarter hour, sometimes longer. He watched her breathing, her color, the tension in her face and shoulders. He watched for the moment when relief arrived, and, critically, he watched for signs he had given too much. 15 minutes passed. Her breathing deepened. Her clenched hands relaxed. The grimace that had contorted her face for hours eased into something resembling peace. She wasn't unconscious, but she was calm. The pain hadn't vanished. She could still feel it, but it no longer consumed her entire awareness. John of St. Amand had threaded the needle successfully this time. The dose was right for this woman, this batch, this day. Tomorrow, with a different patient or different opium, the same calculation might produce disaster. This was medieval medicine at its most sophisticated and most uncertain. Physicians like John possessed genuine knowledge. They understood that opium relieved pain through some mechanism they couldn't fully explain. They knew it was dangerous in excessive amounts. They had observed that it stopped diarrhea, suppressed coughs, induced sleep, and reduced anxiety. But every application was partially guesswork, and the consequences of guessing wrong included death. The most prestigious opium preparation in medieval Europe was theriac, and it embodied everything complex about medieval pharmacology. The recipe varied, but most versions included 60 to 70 ingredients. Opium was essential, but far from the only component. There was viper flesh, supposedly from snakes caught at specific times and prepared through elaborate processes. There were exotic spices like cinnamon, cardamom, and saffron. There were dozens of herbs and roots, each supposedly contributing specific qualities that balanced and enhanced the others. Making theriac was ceremonial. In Venice, which became Europe's premier theriac producer, the preparation happened publicly. City officials oversaw the process to prevent fraud. Each ingredient was verified for authenticity. The mixture was prepared in massive mortars, with multiple apothecaries taking turns at the grinding because the work was exhausting. The resulting paste was aged for years, supposedly improving with time like wine. The finished product cost more by weight than gold. Did theriac work? Absolutely, because it contained opium. Did it work better than plain opium dissolved in wine? Almost certainly not. The other 69 ingredients probably contributed little beyond placebo effect and justification for the enormous price. But medieval physicians believed in component synergy, the idea that properly balanced combinations of substances produced effects greater than any single ingredient. Theriac represented this philosophy taken to its logical extreme. The belief in theriac wasn't just about opium's effects. It was about credibility, about aligning with ancient authority, about demonstrating that you practice sophisticated medicine rather than simple folk healing. A physician who prescribed theriac was announcing his connection to Galen, to centuries of medical tradition, to the idea that medicine was a learned art requiring years of study. Never mind that a simpler opium preparation might work just as well. Complexity signaled expertise. But theriac was for the wealthy. Most people never saw it, never tasted it, never had access to the enormous expense it required. For ordinary medieval Europeans, opium remained largely out of reach. The mathematics were brutal. A useful dose of opium might cost a laborer several days' wages. A serious condition requiring multiple doses could bankrupt a family. Pain relief was expensive, and most people suffered without it. This created a medical hierarchy that tracked wealth almost exactly. Rich merchants and nobles could afford regular opium for chronic conditions. They could summon physicians who owned the expensive texts and knew the proper preparations. They could purchase theriac and other elaborate compounds. The middling sort, prosperous craftsmen and minor clergy, might afford opium in emergencies for acute severe pain that couldn't be endured otherwise. The poor made do with local herbs and prayers. Yet opium did appear in less wealthy contexts, particularly in monasteries. Benedictine monks, following their rules command to care for the sick, maintained infirmaries and physic gardens. Some monasteries grew opium poppies, Papaver somniferum, alongside their medicinal herbs. The white or purple flowers were beautiful, which helped, but the real value lay in the seed pods. Monks would score the unripe pods with small knives, collecting the latex that oozed out and dried into brown resin. This was opium at its most basic, unpurified and inconsistent, but it was locally sourced and therefore cheaper than imported material. Monastic opium use was constrained by religious concerns. The church viewed mind-altering substances with suspicion. Wine was acceptable in moderation because Christ had blessed it, but getting drunk was sinful. Opium occupied an ambiguous space, used to ease the pain of a dying brother, helping him remain conscious and coherent enough to receive last rites. It was merciful medicine. Used to escape melancholy or achieve pleasant stupor, it was spiritually dangerous indulgence. The line between medical necessity and sinful pleasure troubled monastic physicians constantly. Consider the case of Brother Thomas, a composite drawn from several documented monastic medical cases from the 13th century. Brother Thomas suffered from a painful chronic condition, possibly arthritis, though medieval diagnostics couldn't specify precisely. The pain was manageable most days, but occasionally flared into intensity that prevented him from participating in prayers or performing his duties, copying manuscripts. The infirmarian had opium available, grown in the monastery garden. Should he give it to Brother Thomas? During acute flares, yes, clearly. Merciful relief of severe pain was justified. But what about the chronic daily discomfort? Should Brother Thomas receive small doses regularly to function better? The infirmarian worried about habituation, about Brother Thomas becoming dependent on opium and needing ever-increasing amounts. He worried about the spiritual implications of altering Brother Thomas's consciousness daily. He worried about setting a precedent that other monks might demand. But he also worried about Brother Thomas's suffering and diminished capacity to serve God through his work. There was no perfect answer. Different monasteries handled such situations differently. Some were liberal with opium for chronic conditions. Others restricted it severely, viewing suffering as potentially redemptive, a way of sharing in Christ's passion. The lack of uniform policy reflected deep ambivalence about pain, consciousness, and the role of medicine in spiritual life. Secular physicians faced different but related concerns. They worried about patients who sought opium not for legitimate pain, but for the pleasant sensations it produced. They observed that some wealthy patients claimed pain more severe than objective signs suggested, seemingly wanting the opium more than the cure. This was addiction beginning to manifest, though medieval medicine lacked that conceptual framework. Physicians called it habituation or custom, and they recognized it as problematic but struggled to prevent it. The medical texts warned about this. Avicenna had written that patients who used opium regularly became tyrannized by it, unable to function without their accustomed dose. Medieval physicians saw this pattern repeatedly. The patient with genuine chronic pain who needed opium initially, but then needed it psychologically even after the pain improved. The patient whose dose requirements kept climbing despite no worsening of the underlying condition. The patient who became anxious and difficult when opium wasn't available, displaying behavior that seemed out of proportion to their claimed pain level. But what could physicians do? Refusing opium to a patient who claimed severe pain felt cruel and potentially harmful. The physician couldn't look inside the patient's body and objectively measure pain levels. He had to rely on the patient's report, and patients lied or exaggerated. The same uncertainty that made dosing difficult made distinguishing legitimate medical use from problematic habituation nearly impossible. Some physicians attempted to prevent habituation by rotating treatments. They would give opium for several days, then switch to different pain remedies, even if less effective, then return to opium after an interval. The theory was that preventing continuous use would prevent the body from becoming accustomed to the substance. This probably helped in some cases, but medieval medicine couldn't explain why, and the practice wasn't universal. The apothecaries who sold opium occupied a complicated position in this system. They were craftsmen, not physicians, but they held the actual substance and therefore had power. A wealthy patient could visit an apothecary directly, claiming a physician had prescribed opium, and purchase it without verification. Apothecaries were supposed to require physician authorization for powerful medicines, but enforcement was inconsistent and the profit motive was strong. Some apothecaries became known for being willing to sell opium with minimal questions asked, creating early versions of pill mill centuries before that term existed. The guilds that regulated apothecaries try to maintain standards. In major cities, guild rules specified that apothecaries must stock medicines of verified quality, must not substitute inferior ingredients, must not sell dangerous substances without proper authority. But rules and reality diverged. An apothecary whose customer base included wealthy habitual opium users had financial incentive to maintain those relationships. An apothecary in a poor neighborhood might never stock opium at all because his customers couldn't afford it. Quality control remained a persistent nightmare. Beyond the natural variation in opium potency, deliberate adulteration was common. Some suppliers stretched their opium by mixing it with cheaper substances that looked similar. Licorice extract could be blended with opium to increase volume while maintaining the dark color and sticky texture. Clay or chalk could be added as well. The resulting mixture contained less opium than claimed, which was dangerous in its own way because patients received inadequate doses and physicians couldn't calibrate their treatments accurately. Detecting adulteration was difficult without chemical testing, which didn't exist. Experienced apothecaries developed rules of thumb. Pure opium had a characteristic bitter taste. It dissolved in wine or vinegar in predictable ways. It smelled faintly sweet and earthy. But these tests were imperfect, and a skilled adulterator could fool all of them. The result was a market where buyers could never be entirely certain what they were getting, and where that uncertainty had life or death implications. Some cities attempted regulation. Venice, controlling much of the opium trade into Europe, developed standards for imported drugs. Inspectors were supposed to verify quality before foreign medicines entered the city. Similar systems existed in other major trading centers. But inspection was only as good as the inspectors, and bribery was cheaper than lost profits from rejected shipments. The medieval market for opium was like medieval markets for everything else, a mixture of legitimate commerce, quality variation, outright fraud, and regulatory attempts that worked imperfectly at best. The disconnect between medical knowledge and medical practice defined medieval opium use. Physicians knew what opium should do based on theory and texts. Patients knew what opium actually did based on experience. Apothecaries knew what they could sell and for what price. These three forms of knowledge often contradicted each other, and nobody had authority to resolve the contradictions definitively. What emerged was a system that worked tolerably well for elite patients with access to educated physicians and expensive, hopefully pure opium. It worked poorly for everyone else, who either suffered without relief or received inconsistent treatments from practitioners of varying skill using substances of uncertain quality. The gap between best practice and common practice was enormous, and most medieval Europeans experienced the common practice version, with all its inadequacies and dangers. Yet the knowledge continued developing. Physicians shared observations about what worked and what didn't. University medical faculties debated proper opium use. Texts circulated incorporating practical experience alongside theoretical authority. Slowly, gradually, medieval Europe was building an empirical understanding of opium that would supplement the inherited ancient wisdom. They were learning through trial and error, and the errors cost lives, but the learning was real. The stage was set for opium to become thoroughly integrated into European medical practice, for better and worse. The substance was available, the knowledge existed, the demand was constant. What came next was centuries of trying to manage a medicine that was simultaneously indispensable and dangerous, life-saving and potentially life-destroying, the best answer to suffering and the source of new forms of suffering nobody fully understood yet. The monastery of Monte Cassino sits on a rocky hilltop in central Italy, and in the summer of 1176, a young monk named Benedict is learning that mercy has a physical form. He's working in the infirmary under Brother Albertus, the monastery's physician monk who has spent 40 years caring for the sick. An elderly monk lies on a straw mattress, dying slowly from what we would now recognize as cancer. The growth in his abdomen is visible, distending his thin frame, and the pain has become so severe that he can no longer sleep, can barely pray, can only lie there making sounds that are almost but not quite screams. Brother Albertus sends Benedict to the physic garden with specific instructions. Find the poppies in the eastern corner, the white-flowered ones, not the red. Look for pods that are large and green, but beginning to turn pale. Score each pod vertically with shallow cuts, just deep enough to penetrate the outer skin, but not so deep that you damage the interior. Use the bronze knife, never iron, because iron supposedly taints the latex. Do this in the late afternoon when the sun is lower but still warm. Return at dawn tomorrow to collect what has oozed out and dried overnight. Benedict does as instructed, though his hands shake with the responsibility. He's 19 years old, barely past his novitiate, and he's being trusted with preparing medicine that could ease suffering or cause death, depending on how carefully he performs each step. The poppies grow in neat rows, tended as carefully as the roses near the chapel. Their flowers are beautiful, which seems wrong somehow for a plant associated with death and pain. Beauty shouldn't be dangerous. But Brother Albertus has explained that God's creation is complex, that the same plant that makes the white flowers also produces the medicine that eases dying. The next morning, Benedict scrapes the dried brown latex from each scored pod. It comes away in sticky fragments that smell faintly sweet, faintly musty, like earth and decay mixed together. He collects perhaps 2 drams worth, a small amount that took hours of careful work. Brother Albertus takes the latex, examines it closely, nods approval. He dissolves a portion smaller than a peppercorn in wine, adding honey to mask the bitter taste, and helps the dying monk drink. The transformation takes perhaps 20 minutes. The sounds stop. The clenched muscles release. The elderly monk's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid with pain, deepens and slows. His eyes, which had been wild with suffering, become calm. He's not unconscious. He's not cured. But he's no longer being tortured by his own body. He can speak coherently for the first time in days. He asks for the abbot, receives final communion, says goodbye to brothers he's lived alongside for decades. He dies 3 days later, but he dies as a monk rather than as a screaming animal, and Brother Albertus tells Benedict this is what their medicine is for. This was monastic medicine at its most essential. Behind monastery walls across medieval Europe, monks were preserving knowledge that was disappearing everywhere else. When Rome fell and the urban centers collapsed, when libraries burned and schools closed, when the infrastructure that supported educated physicians crumbled, the monasteries remained. They were stable institutions with long-term perspectives, some existing continuously for centuries. They had the resources to maintain gardens and scriptoriums. They had the cultural commitment to preserving texts and caring for the sick. They became, by default, the primary medical providers for much of medieval Europe. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, established care of the sick as a fundamental monastic duty. The rules stated explicitly that the sick should be served as Christ himself, that their care took precedence over almost everything else. This wasn't just pious sentiment. It created practical obligations. Every significant Benedictine monastery maintained an infirmary. Most had a dedicated infirmarian, usually a monk with medical training or at least extensive experience. Many grew medicinal herbs and prepared their own medicines. The physic gardens where monks grew opium poppies were carefully planned spaces. They weren't recreational gardens. They were pharmaceutical factories before that concept existed. Location mattered. The garden needed good sun exposure for most medicinal plants, but some shade for others. It needed reliable water, usually from a well or diverted stream. It needed walls or fences to keep animals out and to maintain some temperature control. Inside these walls, monks cultivated dozens of plant species, each with specific medical applications documented in the manuscripts they copied and consulted. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, occupied a special place in these gardens. It was difficult to grow properly. The seeds were tiny, requiring careful sowing in prepared soil. The plants needed consistent moisture, but not waterlogging. They were vulnerable to various pests and diseases. The timing of harvest was critical. Score the pods too early, and they produced insufficient latex. Wait too long, and the pods dried out, the latex solidified inside, and the harvest was lost. Growing opium required knowledge passed from experienced monks to younger ones, accumulated over generations of trial and error. Harvesting was even more demanding. The technique Benedict learned that afternoon in 1176 was standard across monasteries that grew their own opium. Vertical cuts in the unripe pod, shallow enough to avoid damaging seeds inside, deep enough to let latex ooze out. The best time was late afternoon or early evening, allowing the latex to flow and begin drying overnight. By morning, it had thickened into resin that could be scraped away. Each pod could be scored multiple times over several days as it continued maturing, but the first harvest generally produced the most potent latex. The yield was modest. A substantial poppy patch, perhaps 50 square feet, might produce only a few ounces of dried opium over an entire growing season. This meant monasteries that relied on homegrown opium had very limited supplies. They couldn't waste it. They couldn't give it casually for minor complaints. It was reserved for serious conditions, usually severe pain or end-of-life care. The scarcity imposed discipline that was probably therapeutically beneficial, preventing the habituation that wealthy patients with unlimited access sometimes developed. Monastic record-keeping gives us glimpses into how opium was actually used. The account books for major monasteries tracked expensive medicines carefully. References to opium purchases appear sporadically, usually in small quantities, always expensive. References to poppy cultivation appear in garden inventories. Treatment records, when they exist, mention opium in context of specific cases. A monk injured in a construction accident. An elderly monk dying from unknown internal disease. Occasionally a secular patient, because many monasteries provided medical care to nearby communities as part of their charitable mission. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland kept particularly detailed records. In 1223, they treated a nobleman who had been gored by a boar during a hunt. The wound was deep, penetrating his thigh, and the pain was severe enough that he couldn't be moved safely. The infirmarian administered opium dissolved in strong wine 3 times daily for 5 days, then twice daily for another week as the pain gradually subsided. The total amount used was recorded as half an ounce, a substantial quantity that probably represented a significant portion of their annual supply. The nobleman survived, recovered enough to travel home, and donated generously to the monastery, which was probably the only reason the expensive treatment was economically viable. But monastic medicine wasn't primarily about wealthy donors. Most patients were monks themselves or poor locals who had nowhere else to go. For these patients, opium was rare and precious. Brother Albertus, teaching young Benedict, emphasized that wasting opium on insufficient need was nearly as bad as withholding it from desperate suffering. Judgment was required. A monk with a headache didn't need opium, no matter how much he complained. A monk dying in agony did need it, and providing it was both medical duty and spiritual mercy. The spiritual dimensions of opium used troubled monastic physicians constantly. Pain was complex theologically. Some medieval thinkers argued that suffering was redemptive, that bearing pain patiently brought one closer to understanding Christ's passion. Others argued that unnecessary suffering served no purpose and that relieving it was merciful. The debate wasn't abstract. It determined whether monks in pain received medicine or were told to pray harder. Different monastic orders approached this differently. The Benedictines generally favored medical intervention. Their rule emphasized practical care of the body as necessary for spiritual life. You couldn't pray effectively if you were screaming in pain. The Cistercians, a reform movement emphasizing austerity, were more suspicious of pain relief. Some Cistercian houses restricted opium use severely, viewing endurance of suffering as spiritually valuable. The Carthusians, committed to extreme asceticism, sometimes refused opium entirely, though this policy softened over time as practical experience showed that some suffering was simply incompatible with conscious spiritual practice. There was also concern about consciousness alteration. Opium didn't just relieve pain. It changed perception, affected judgment, produced sensations that could be pleasurable independent of pain relief. This troubled monks who were supposed to maintain constant awareness of God's presence. If opium altered your consciousness, were you truly yourself anymore? Were your prayers valid? Could you receive sacraments properly while under opium's influence? These weren't trivial questions in communities where spiritual state was the fundamental concern. The monastery of Cluny developed elaborate guidelines for opium use that try to navigate these tensions. Opium could be given for severe physical pain, but not for mental distress or spiritual despair. It could be given to dying monks, but should be timed so they could remain conscious for last rites. It could be given for injuries, but should be discontinued as soon as the acute pain subsided, even if some discomfort remained. The dose should be the minimum necessary for tolerable pain levels, not complete elimination of all sensation. These rules reflected sophisticated thinking about the difference between necessary medicine and potentially sinful indulgence. Enforcing such rules was difficult. Pain is subjective. One monk's severe pain is another's moderate discomfort. The infirmarian had to make judgment calls that affected both physical suffering and spiritual well-being. Some infirmarians were strict, erring on the side of withholding opium unless absolutely necessary. Others were compassionate to the point of leniency, giving it more freely. Neither approach was clearly correct, and both sometimes produced unfortunate outcomes. The manuscripts that monks copied in their scriptoriums preserved and transmitted opium knowledge across generations. The work was painstaking. Sitting in poorly lit rooms, using quill pens and expensive parchment, monks would copy medical texts letter by letter. A complete copy of a major work like Avicenna's canon might take a single scribe years. Errors crept in. Latin transliterated from Arabic was recopied by monks who didn't understand Arabic. Technical terms were confused. Dosage amounts were transcribed incorrectly. But the work continued because the knowledge mattered. Some monks added marginal notes based on their own experience. Next to Dioscorides' description of opium, a 12th century monk of Fulda Monastery wrote that he had found warming the wine before dissolving opium made it work faster. Another monk, identity lost, noted in a margin that elderly patients seemed more sensitive to opium than younger ones and should receive smaller doses. These observations, scattered across hundreds of manuscripts in dozens of monasteries, represented practical knowledge accumulating slowly through experience. The illuminated manuscripts that decorated some of these texts are beautiful enough that many survive in museums today. The images of poppy plants are sometimes botanically accurate, sometimes stylized into decorative patterns. Some manuscripts show the harvesting process, monks scoring pods in garden settings. Others show the medical application, a monk physician offering a cup to a patient. These illuminations weren't just decorative. They were instructional, helping less literate monks understand the plants and procedures described in the Latin text they might struggle to read fluently. But literacy varied enormously even within monasteries. Some monks were scholars who could read Latin medical texts easily. Others had basic literacy sufficient for prayers, but struggled with technical vocabulary. The transmission of medical knowledge, therefore, happened partly through texts, but largely through direct teaching. An experienced infirmarian would train younger monks by having them work alongside him in the garden and infirmary. They would learn by watching, by doing, by making mistakes under supervision rather than on their own. This apprenticeship system meant that practical knowledge often exceeded written knowledge. Brother Albertus, teaching young Benedict how to harvest opium latex, was passing along techniques refined over generations, techniques that might not be fully documented in any text. He knew from experience that bronze knives worked better than iron ones for scoring pods, though he probably couldn't explain the chemistry of why. He knew that latex collected just after dawn was slightly more potent than latex collected at midday, though no manuscript specified this. He knew that opium stored in sealed ceramic jars stayed effective longer than opium left in cloth bags, though the text just said to store it carefully. The monasteries also served as networks for sharing medical knowledge. Monks traveled between houses. A monk from Monte Cassino might spend time at Cluny, bringing techniques and observations with him. Correspondence between abbots sometimes included medical information. When a monastery developed an effective treatment or improved technique, the innovation could spread through these networks, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. Consider how the practice of diluting opium in wine became standard. Ancient texts mentioned it, but different traditions existed. Some physicians used vinegar, some used water, some used wine. Through monastic experience and communication, wine became the preferred solvent in most of Western Europe by the 13th century. Wine dissolved opium reliably. It masked the bitter taste reasonably well. It was readily available in monasteries that made their own wine. The alcohol content possibly enhanced opium's effects, though medieval physicians didn't understand why. This practical consensus emerged not from any single authority decreeing it, but from collective experience shared across monastic networks. The same networks transmitted warnings. When a monastery experienced problems with opium, whether deaths from overdose or monks becoming habituated, that information spread. Not systematically, not quickly, but it spread. Other infirmarians heard about it and adjusted their practice accordingly. The knowledge was statistical in nature, pattern recognition rather than controlled studies, but it was real learning from collective experience. Monastic medicine also intersected with lay medical practice in important ways. Many monasteries ran hospitals or infirmaries that served surrounding communities. Poor people who couldn't afford urban physicians could seek care from monks who charged little or nothing. This meant monks treated a wider range of conditions than they would if serving only their own communities. A farmer injured by his plow, a woman with difficult childbirth, a child with persistent cough. These cases gave monastic physicians experience that informed their understanding of opium's uses and limits. But it also meant decisions about rationing. The monastery's opium supply was finite and expensive, whether homegrown or purchased. Should they use on a dying peasant who couldn't pay anything? The theological answer was yes. Christian charity demanded it. The practical answer was more complex. If they used all their opium on charity cases, they would have none left for their own monks or for donors whose gratitude supported the monastery financially. Different houses balanced these concerns differently, and the balance shifted with circumstances. The monastery of Fleury in France recorded a crisis in 1268. Plague struck the region, not the Great Black Death that would come later, but a serious local epidemic. The infirmary was overwhelmed. Dozens of people, monks and laypeople both, were sick and dying. The infirmarian faced impossible decisions. He had perhaps 3 ounces of opium total. He could give small amounts to many people, providing minimal relief to each, or larger amounts to fewer people, easing their deaths properly, but leaving others to suffer without help. The records don't say what he chose, only that the epidemic eventually ended and the infirmarian himself died during it, possibly from exhaustion as much as disease. These were the realities of monastic medicine. Theoretical knowledge from ancient authorities, practical experience accumulated over generations, theological concerns about the spiritual implications of pain and relief, resource limitations that forced difficult choices, and always the fundamental mandate to care for the suffering. Opium fit into this complex system as powerful medicine that embodied all its contradictions. It relieved suffering, which was merciful and good. It altered consciousness, which was spiritually ambiguous. It was expensive and scarce, which meant not everyone who might benefit could receive it. It was dangerous in excessive amounts, which meant every use carried risk. Young Benedict, collecting latex from scored poppy pods on that summer afternoon in 1176, was inheriting all of this. He was learning a practical skill, yes, but also entering a tradition of medical care that stretched back centuries and would continue for centuries more. He was becoming part of the system that preserved opium knowledge through the medieval period, that developed practical wisdom through experience, that grappled with the tensions between relieving suffering and the spiritual dangers of consciousness alteration. The monasteries were the backbone of medieval medicine for hundreds of years. They weren't the only medical providers, but they were the most stable, the most widespread, and often the most accessible to ordinary people. The opium knowledge they preserved, the techniques they refined, the practical wisdom they accumulated through caring for thousands of patients over generations, all of this formed a foundation that would support European medicine as it evolved. When universities eventually took over medical education, when urban physicians became more common, when the monastery's dominance in healthcare gradually declined, they left a legacy of careful observation and documented experience that informed everything that came after. Brother Albertus, watching the dying monk receive relief from suffering, knowing the opium couldn't cure but could provide mercy, understanding that sometimes the physician's highest calling was easing the transition from life to death rather than fighting death pointlessly. This represented medieval medicine at its most humane. The knowledge was imperfect. The theory was often wrong. The resources were limited. But the commitment to reducing suffering within the constraints of available means and theological acceptability was genuine. The year is 1291, and a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo is dying in a Genoese prison. He's been captured during one of the endless wars between Italian city-states, and the conditions are brutal. But he's talking, dictating stories to a fellow prisoner named Rusticolo, and among the tales of Kublai Khan and the wonders of Cathay, he describes something that would have sounded familiar to any physician listening. He describes markets in distant cities where opium is sold as commonly as pepper, where the substance Europeans pay fortunes for is merely another commodity, abundant and relatively cheap. This was an exaggeration. Marco Polo had seen the source, had traveled through regions where opium poppies grew in vast fields rather than small monastery gardens, where the harvest was measured in hundreds of pounds rather than ounces. He had seen the trade networks that moved opium from Persia and India and Anatolia westward toward Europe, networks that made fortunes for those who controlled them. He had seen what Venice and Genoa were really fighting over, beneath the surface politics and territorial disputes. They were fighting over access to Eastern trade, and opium was part of that trade, expensive enough to justify the enormous risks of long-distance commerce. Understanding medieval opium means understanding medieval trade, because the two were inseparable. Europe didn't produce enough opium to meet demand. The climate was wrong in most regions. Northern Europe was too cold, too wet. Even Southern Europe could grow poppies, but never in quantities sufficient for continental needs. The opium that dissolved in wine cups across Europe, that eased the deaths of monks and nobles, that filled the expensive Theriac preparations, almost all of it came from elsewhere. It came from the East, and getting it to European patients required a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles and crossed multiple political boundaries, each transition adding cost and risk. The Byzantine Empire, before its gradual collapse, served as the primary bridge. Constantinople sat at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, controlling trade through the Bosphorus. Byzantine merchants maintained connections with Persian and Arab traders who could source opium from growing regions. The substance flowed through Constantinople, was taxed there, was sometimes adulterated there, and then moved onward to Italian merchants who would distribute it throughout Western Europe. This system worked tolerably well for centuries, but it made opium expensive. Every middleman took a cut. Every border crossing meant fees. Every ruler whose territory the caravans passed through demanded payment. The Crusades disrupted and reorganized these patterns. When European armies captured ports along the Levantine coast, they inadvertently created new trade routes. Acre, Tyre, Antioch, these Crusader cities became commercial centers where Eastern goods entered European hands more directly. The military campaigns were disasters, but the commercial opportunities were extraordinary. Italian merchants, particularly Venetians and Genoese, established permanent trading posts in Crusader territories. They negotiated agreements with Muslim merchants and rulers, because profit mattered more than religious differences to practical businessmen. These merchants weren't altruistic. They were pursuing wealth, and opium represented serious money. A Venetian merchant who invested in an opium shipment, assuming it arrived safely, could expect returns that justified the substantial risks. The problem was that safety wasn't guaranteed. Overland caravans faced bandits. Ships faced storms and pirates. Political upheavals could close borders or confiscate goods. Insurance didn't exist in the modern sense. Every shipment was essentially gambling, but the gambling paid off often enough to keep the trade flowing. By the 13th century, Venice had emerged as Europe's dominant opium importer. The Venetian merchant fleet was the largest and most sophisticated in Europe. Venetian trading networks extended throughout the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea. Venetian merchants had permanent stations in Alexandria, in Constantinople, in Syrian ports, anywhere that goods from the east could be acquired. They bought opium in bulk, transported it to Venice, and redistributed it throughout Europe at substantial markup. The Venetian Republic understood the value of this trade and regulated it carefully. Opium was classified as a restricted substance requiring licensing to import or sell. The government wanted to prevent fraud, ensure quality, and of course collect taxes. Official inspectors were supposed to verify opium shipments before they entered the city. In practice, inspection was inconsistent and corruption was endemic, but the regulatory framework existed and sometimes functioned. Venice also dominated theriac production, and this was directly connected to the opium trade. Venetian theriac, called treacle in English, became the most prestigious formulation in Europe. The city turned public theriac production into theater, a way of demonstrating both the substance's legitimacy and Venice's commercial sophistication. Several times per year, the production would happen in public squares with city officials present. Each ingredient would be displayed and verified. The mixing would be done in massive mortars by teams of apothecaries. The finished product would be sealed with official stamps guaranteeing its authenticity. This was marketing genius. By making theriac production public and official, Venice created brand value. A buyer purchasing theriac from Venice could claim to have a genuine article, properly prepared, worth the enormous expense. Never mind that much of the benefit came from the opium content, and the other 60-odd ingredients were probably superfluous. The perception of quality justified premium pricing, and premium pricing generated profits that funded Venice's commercial and military power. But Venice didn't have a monopoly. Genoa competed fiercely for Eastern trade access. The two cities fought multiple wars over commercial advantages, wars that looked like territorial disputes, but were really about controlling trade routes. When Marco Polo languished in that Genoese prison dictating his travels, he was a casualty of this commercial rivalry. Genoa had captured him during a naval battle that was fundamentally about which city would dominate Eastern Mediterranean trade, including opium. The trade routes themselves were marvels of medieval logistics. Consider the journey of a typical opium shipment from source to European consumer. It might begin in Anatolia, where Turkish or Armenian farmers grew poppies and harvested latex. Local merchants would collect small amounts from many farmers, consolidating them into larger quantities. These would be sold to regional traders who would transport the opium to coastal ports or major inland cities. There, Italian or Byzantine merchants would purchase bulk quantities, arranging shipping to Constantinople or directly to Italian ports if they had access. The overland portion of this journey was dangerous and slow. Caravans moved at walking speed, perhaps 20 miles per day, in good conditions. They traveled in groups for protection, sometimes hiring armed guards. They stopped at caravanserais, the fortified and spaced along major routes where travelers could rest, water animals, and trade goods. Some caravanserais functioned as informal markets where merchants from different regions met and exchanged products. Opium changed hands multiple times during these stops, each transaction adding cost. The maritime portion, once goods reached Mediterranean ports, was faster but riskier. A Venetian galley could sail from Syrian ports to Venice in perhaps 3 weeks with favorable winds, but storms could delay or destroy ships. Piracy was constant. Christian pirates attacked Muslim vessels. Muslim pirates attacked Christian vessels. Pirates of all faiths attacked anyone who looked profitable. The Mediterranean was a contested commercial space where violence and trade coexisted uneasily. Insurance mechanisms gradually developed to manage these risks. By the late 13th century, merchants could purchase contracts where others would assume part of the financial risk in exchange for a percentage of the profits. This allowed individual merchants to participate in opium trade without risking total ruin if a single shipment was lost. It also created a financial industry around trade that multiplied the number of people with stakes in keeping commerce flowing. The Black Death, arriving in Europe in 1347, devastated these trade networks along with everything else. The plague killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, maybe more in some regions. Merchants died. Sailors died. The workers who loaded and unloaded ships died. Demand for opium actually increased as physicians prescribed it for plague sufferers, trying desperately to ease symptoms they couldn't cure. But supply chains collapsed because the people who operated them were dead or fleeing. Opium prices spiked dramatically during and immediately after the plague years. The substance was already expensive, but it became nearly unobtainable for anyone except the wealthiest patients. Monasteries that had maintained modest opium supplies found they couldn't replenish them. Apothecaries in cities ran through their stocks and couldn't acquire more. Physicians had to watch patients suffer without effective pain relief because the supply chain had broken. The economic disruption took decades to repair. Slowly, as populations partially recovered and trade networks reconstituted themselves, opium began flowing more reliably again. But the plague had demonstrated Europe's vulnerability. Dependence on Eastern sources for crucial medicines meant that any major disruption in trade left European physicians helpless. Some medical thinkers began advocating for European opium cultivation to reduce this dependence, but the economics were difficult. European-grown opium cost more to produce than imported opium, even accounting for transport costs, because labor was expensive and yields were modest in Europe's less-than-ideal climate. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 represented another major disruption. The Byzantine Empire, that ancient bridge between East and West, finally collapsed. The Ottomans now controlled the crucial straits and much of the eastern Mediterranean coast. European merchants had to negotiate new arrangements with Ottoman authorities. Some trade continued, because the Ottomans had economic interest in commerce, but the terms changed and costs increased. These disruptions revealed something important about medieval opium use. It was never a stable system. It was always precarious, always dependent on political circumstances beyond anyone's control, always vulnerable to warfare or disease or climate events that could shut down supply chains. The physicians who prescribed opium, the patients who depended on it, they existed at the end of a long, fragile chain that could break at any point. Consider the experience of a wealthy Florentine merchant in 1460, suffering from kidney stones. His physician prescribes opium for the pain. The apothecary has it in stock because Florence has good commercial connections with Venice. But the opium's journey to that apothecary began months earlier in Anatolia. It traveled through Ottoman territories, was shipped across the Mediterranean, passed through Venetian inspection and taxation, was purchased by a Florentine merchant house, and finally reached the apothecary's shop. At any point in that chain, things could have gone wrong. The caravan could have been raided. The ship could have sunk. War could have closed borders. The patient's relief from suffering depended on all of these distant events proceeding smoothly, and he likely had no idea how precarious his medicine supply actually was. The people who did understand were the merchants who controlled the trade. They knew exactly how fragile these networks were because they built and maintained them. They knew which rulers demanded reasonable bribes versus ruinous ones. They knew which routes were currently safe and which were too dangerous. They knew when political situations were deteriorating and trade would become difficult or impossible. This knowledge gave them power that went beyond simple economics. They were gatekeepers controlling access to medicines that European physicians and patients desperately needed. Some merchants became extraordinarily wealthy from this trade. The Medici family in Florence, before they became rulers, made part of their fortune from pharmaceutical trade, including opium. They had connections throughout the Mediterranean, could arrange complex transactions, could acquire goods that others couldn't access. This wealth translated into political power and eventually into control of Florence itself. Opium was just one commodity among many that they traded, but it was a profitable one with relatively stable demand regardless of other economic conditions. The ethics of this system troubled some medieval thinkers. Was it right that a substance needed for merciful medical care should be controlled by profit-seeking merchants? That access to pain relief depended on ability to pay prices inflated by multiple middlemen? That geography and wealth determined who suffered and who received mercy? These questions had no satisfactory answers. The market system worked tolerably well at getting opium from where it grew to where it was needed, but it worked through pricing mechanisms that excluded most people from access. Some religious orders tried to address this through charity. Hospitals run by religious foundations would sometimes treat poor patients without charge, using opium donated by wealthy benefactors. But charitable supply never matched need. For every poor person who received donated opium, dozens suffered without it because the system couldn't provide for everyone. The trade routes that brought opium to Europe also brought other goods, silk and spices and dyes and gems, creating a cultural exchange that reshaped European life. Merchants and travelers returned from the East with stories of different medical practices, different technologies, different ways of organizing society. The opium trade was embedded in this larger transformation, part of how medieval Europe gradually became connected to wider world systems. But connection meant vulnerability. When distant events disrupted trade, Europe felt the effects. When drought in Anatolia reduced poppy harvests, European patients suffered. When wars closed trade routes, prices spiked and access disappeared. The market that brought opium to Europe also subjected European medical care to forces beyond anyone's control. Geographic and political and climatic events happening thousands of miles away that nonetheless determined whether a dying patient in Paris or London or Prague would receive relief or suffer without mercy. This was the reality of medieval opium supply. It worked, after a fashion. It got the substance from where it grew to where physicians needed it. But it worked imperfectly, unreliably, expensively, and always with the possibility that the next war or plague or storm would shut everything down and leave patients with no options except suffering and prayer. The year is 1348, and a surgeon named Guy de Chauliac is facing something he's never encountered before. He's in Avignon, the papal city in southern France, and people are dying everywhere. The plague has arrived, the Black Death that will kill perhaps half of Europe's population. and guys watching helplessly as patients developed the characteristic buboes, the swollen lymph nodes in groin and armpit that signal almost certain death. He has opium. He has all the medical knowledge of the 14th century at his disposal, and none of it matters because the disease kills regardless of treatment. But Guy de Chauliac does something anyway. He administers opium to dying patients not to cure them, which he knows is impossible, but to ease the transition. He watches their agonized breathing become calmer. He sees the terror leave their eyes, even as death approaches. He documents this in his surgical text, Chirurgia Magna, noting that when medicine cannot cure, it must at least provide mercy. This observation, written while plague corpses piled in Avignon's streets, represents medieval medicine's most fundamental application of opium. Sometimes healing isn't possible. Sometimes the only thing left is reducing suffering. Medieval physicians used opium across a spectrum of conditions that reveals both the sophistication of their practice and the desperation of their circumstances. Pain management stood at the center, but pain came in countless forms. There was acute pain from injuries, the immediate screaming agony of a broken bone or deep wound. There was surgical pain, the conscious torture of operations performed without anything resembling modern anesthesia. There was chronic pain from diseases that medieval medicine couldn't cure, conditions that ground patients down day after day until they broke. And there was the pain of dying, the body's final protests as systems failed and consciousness slipped away. For acute injuries, opium was a calculation. A man falls from scaffolding, his leg shattered. The surgeon must set the bone, must manipulate fragments back into alignment, must work while the patient is conscious because unconsciousness itself was dangerous and poorly understood. Without opium, the pain makes the patient thrash and fight, making proper bone setting nearly impossible. With opium, the patient becomes manageable, still feels pain, but doesn't react as violently, gives the surgeon a chance to work properly. The dose required judgment. Too little, and the benefit was minimal. Too much, and the patient might stop breathing, which defeated the purpose of treating the injury. Theodoric Borgognoni, an Italian surgeon and Dominican friar working in the 13th century, developed a technique that pushed opium use in new directions. He described creating sleeping sponges, pieces of sea sponge soaked in opium mixed with other substances, including mandragora and hemlock. The patient would inhale the vapors from these sponges, falling into a stupor that allowed surgery to proceed with reduced movement and screaming. This was crude anesthesia, dangerous and unpredictable, but it represented genuine innovation. Theodoric understood that pain itself caused surgical complications, that patients who thrashed in agony were harder to treat successfully, that finding ways to reduce consciousness during operations could improve outcomes. The technique never became standard practice because it was too dangerous. The line between helpful stupor and fatal overdose was invisible and uncrossable with medieval knowledge. Surgeons who tried it sometimes killed patients accidentally, which discredited the method. But the attempt itself shows medieval physicians thinking creatively about pain management, trying to solve practical problems with available tools, even when the margin of safety was terrifyingly narrow. Chronic pain presented different challenges. A patient suffering from what we might now recognize as arthritis, experiencing daily joint pain that never fully resolved. A woman with recurring severe headaches. A man with abdominal pain from ulcers or tumors, or any number of conditions medieval diagnostics couldn't distinguish. These patients needed sustained relief, but sustained opium use created the habituation problem that physicians increasingly recognized. Some physicians attempted rotating treatments, giving opium for several days, then switching to other pain remedies, then returning to opium after an interval. The theory was that interrupting continuous use would prevent the body from becoming dependent. This probably helped in some cases, though medieval medicine couldn't explain the mechanism. Other physicians simply accepted habituation as the lesser evil, reasoning that a patient who functioned tolerably well with regular opium was better off than one who suffered constantly without it. End-of-life care became opium's most ethically clear application. When a patient was clearly dying, when no treatment could reverse the underlying condition, opium served purely to ease suffering. Medieval physicians understood this distinction clearly. They recognized that trying to cure someone who couldn't be cured was pointless and sometimes cruel, that prolonging life by days or hours while increasing suffering was bad medicine. Giving opium to dying patients wasn't controversial. It was merciful, compassionate, aligned with Christian values of easing suffering even as death approached. Consider the death of King Louis IX of France in 1270. He died during the Eighth Crusade, possibly from dysentery, definitely from some condition his physicians couldn't cure. Contemporary accounts describe his final days with substantial pain, and they mention his physicians administering medicines for comfort. While the accounts don't specifically name opium, it would have been standard practice for a dying king whose physicians had access to the best medicines available. His death was documented as peaceful, which suggests effective pain management allowed him to maintain consciousness and dignity until the end. Gastrointestinal conditions represented another major category of opium use. Dysentery, the bloody flux that could kill through dehydration and debilitation, was common and often fatal. Opium's constipating effect made it the most effective treatment available. By slowing intestinal motility, it reduced diarrhea and gave patients a chance to recover. This application had solid empirical support. Physicians observed repeatedly that patients with severe diarrhea improved after receiving opium, assuming the underlying condition wasn't immediately fatal. But dosing for gastrointestinal conditions was tricky. The amount needed to control diarrhea effectively was sometimes close to amounts that caused dangerous sedation. A patient weak from days of fluid loss was more sensitive to opium's effects than a healthy person. Physicians had to balance stopping the diarrhea against the risk of overdosing an already compromised patient. Success required experience and luck in roughly equal measure. Respiratory ailments, particularly chronic coughing, also fell within opium's treatment scope. Consumption, the wasting disease we now call tuberculosis, produced persistent coughs that exhausted patients and prevented sleep. Opium suppressed the cough reflex, allowing rest that was itself therapeutic. Medieval physicians recognized that some patients declined not from the disease itself, but from exhaustion caused by constant coughing. Breaking that cycle with opium could improve outcomes, even if it didn't cure the underlying infection. The application to respiratory problems wasn't without controversy. Some physicians worried that suppressing cough prevented the body from expelling disease matter that needed to be cleared. Humoral theory suggested that coughs served a purpose, helping the body balance its fluids by expelling excess phlegm. Interfering with this natural process seemed potentially harmful, but clinical observation usually won out. Physicians saw that patients who could rest because their coughing was controlled often improved, while patients who coughed constantly declined. Practical results outweighed theoretical concerns. Mental disturbances and insomnia occupied ambiguous territory. Opium clearly helped people sleep. It reduced anxiety. It could calm patients experiencing what medieval medicine called melancholy or frenzy, conditions that probably encompassed everything from depression to psychosis. But using opium for mental conditions rather than physical pain troubled physicians. The mind was closer to the soul, and altering consciousness felt spiritually dangerous in ways that pain relief didn't. Some physicians prescribed opium for severe insomnia, reasoning that sleep was necessary for health and that chronic sleep deprivation was itself a medical crisis. Others refused, arguing that insomnia usually had underlying causes that should be addressed rather than masked with opium. The debate reflected broader uncertainty about treating symptoms versus causes, about whether medicines that altered consciousness were legitimate medical interventions or dangerous shortcuts. Childbirth represented the most controversial application. Medieval texts show conflicting advice about opium use during labor. Some physicians described giving small amounts to women experiencing prolonged, difficult labor, arguing that reducing the mother's distress could facilitate delivery. Others warned strongly against it, noting that opium could slow labor, could potentially harm the infant, could cause complications that endangered both mother and child. The theological dimensions complicated everything. Some medieval thinkers, drawing on Genesis, argued that painful childbirth was divine punishment for Eve's sin and that attempting to reduce it was opposing God's will. Others argued that reducing unnecessary suffering was always appropriate, that God gave humans medicine for exactly this purpose. Different regions and different time periods tilted toward different interpretations, meaning that a woman in labor might receive opium or might be told suffering was spiritually necessary, depending on where and when she lived. Military medicine pushed opium use to its limits. Battlefield wounds were horrible, crushing injuries from maces and axes, penetrating wounds from arrows and swords, burns from siege warfare. Medieval military physicians faced carnage that would challenge modern trauma surgeons, and they faced it with medieval tools and knowledge. Opium was among their most valuable resources. Henri de Mondeville, a French military surgeon in the early 14th century, wrote extensively about battlefield medicine. He described treating hundreds of wounded soldiers during various campaigns. His accounts mention opium repeatedly as essential for managing pain that would otherwise drive wounded men into shock and death. He noted that soldiers who received opium early after injury survived more often than those who didn't, suggesting that pain management itself was life-saving beyond just being humane. But battlefield opium use faced practical limitations. Military physicians had to ration limited supplies across many wounded. They had to make triage decisions, determining who would benefit most from scarce medicines. A soldier with relatively minor wounds might receive no opium, because supplies needed to be reserved for more serious cases. A soldier with fatal injuries might receive large amounts to ease dying, which was merciful but consumed resources. These decisions, made rapidly under terrible conditions, showed medieval medicine operating at its most pragmatic and brutal. The dosing practices that evolved through all these applications were sophisticated given the limitations. Physicians generally measured opium in grains, with a grain being a standardized unit roughly equivalent to 65 milligrams. A typical pain relief dose might be 2 to 4 grains. A dose for controlling severe diarrhea might be slightly higher. A dose for inducing sleep could be lower. But these were guidelines, not absolutes. Individual responses varied. Opium potency varied. Circumstances varied. Experienced physicians developed empirical skills. They learned to observe patients carefully after administering opium, watching for signs the dose was appropriate or excessive. They learned to adjust dosing based on patient size, age, general health, and what else the patient had consumed. They learned through experience which conditions responded best to opium and which were better treated with other remedies. This knowledge couldn't be fully captured in texts. It lived in the accumulated clinical experience of practicing physicians who learned from their successes and their mistakes. The mistakes were often fatal. Overdose deaths happened regularly enough that medical texts devoted substantial attention to recognizing and treating them. Avicenna's descriptions of opium poisoning were copied and consulted throughout the medieval period. Symptoms included profound sedation progressing to unconsciousness, shallow breathing that could stop entirely, cold, clammy skin, and pupils constricted to pinpoints. Treatment involved forcing vomiting if the patient had recently ingested the opium, aggressive physical stimulation to prevent unconsciousness, administration of substances believed to counteract opium's effects, and prayer. The reality was that once a patient was deeply poisoned, medieval medicine had limited effective interventions. Keeping them awake and moving helped if caught early. Otherwise, physicians could only watch and hope the patient's body could metabolize the excess opium before respiratory failure caused death. Some patients survived massive overdoses. Others died from amounts that should have been safe. The unpredictability haunted every physician who prescribed opium. Despite all the dangers and limitations, opium remained indispensable to medieval medicine. It was the most effective pain reliever available. It treated conditions that would otherwise cause preventable deaths. It eased the dying process for countless patients who deserved mercy at the end. The benefits were real and substantial, even accounting for all the risks and complications and tragedies. A medieval physician, standing at a patient's bedside with opium available, faced a fundamentally human decision. He could provide relief, knowing he might cause harm. He could withhold it, knowing the patient would suffer needlessly. There was no perfect choice, just difficult judgment calls made without adequate information under circumstances where either action or inaction could produce tragedy. That burden, the weight of making decisions about suffering and risk without certainty, defined medieval medicine and defined every physician's relationship with opium. They used it because they had to, because patients needed something and nothing else worked as well, because the alternative to accepting risk was accepting preventable suffering. It wasn't a good system, but it was the only system they had. The year is 1327, and a wealthy Parisian cloth merchant named Guillaume has a problem that his money cannot solve. He's been taking opium for 6 years, since a riding accident left him with chronic back pain that never fully healed. His physician prescribed it initially for acute relief, 2 grains dissolved in wine each evening. It worked beautifully. The pain receded. Sleep became possible again. Guillaume could manage his business, could walk without wincing, could live something resembling a normal life. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Now Guillaume takes 8 grains per day, sometimes more. The dose that once brought relief barely touches the pain anymore. Worse, something happens when he tries to reduce the amount. His hands shake. Sweat pours from his body despite cool weather. His legs ache worse than his back ever did. His stomach cramps. Sleep becomes impossible not from pain, but from a restless torment that drives him from bed to pace until dawn. And there's something else, something harder to describe. A profound anxiety, a feeling that something terrible is about to happen, a psychological distress that has no object but feels more real than the physical symptoms. Guillaume's physician recognizes what's happening because he's seen it before. He doesn't call it addiction. That word won't enter medical vocabulary for centuries. He calls it habituation or custom, the body becoming accustomed to opium such that it now requires the substance to function normally. The physician knows what should happen next. Guillaume should gradually reduce his dose, endure several weeks of discomfort, and emerge free from opium dependence. But Guillaume has tried this. The suffering during reduction is worse than the original back pain ever was. He cannot function. He cannot work. He cannot sleep. After 3 days of torment, he takes opium again, and the symptoms vanish within an hour. This is the trap. Guillaume is caught in a cycle where opium has become necessary not to feel good, but to avoid feeling catastrophically bad. His physician is sympathetic, but limited in what he can offer. There are no addiction treatment protocols. There are no rehabilitation facilities. There is only the vague recommendation to use willpower and endure, advice that proves useless against the physiological reality of withdrawal. Guillaume will likely take opium for the rest of his life, his dose creeping upward as tolerance builds, his expense mounting, his dependence absolute. Medieval physicians observed this pattern repeatedly, but struggled to explain it within their theoretical frameworks. Humoral theory suggested that regular opium use permanently altered the body's balance of humors, creating an acquired need that hadn't existed originally. The body, accustomed to opium's cold and dry qualities, could no longer maintain proper balance without continued administration. This explanation was scientifically wrong, but captured an essential truth. Opium changed the body in lasting ways. Once that change occurred, stopping wasn't simply a matter of choice or willpower. Avicenna had documented habituation with clinical precision 5 centuries before Guillaume's predicament. His canon described patients who required increasingly large doses to achieve the same effects, patients who suffered terribly when opium was withdrawn, patients who never successfully freed themselves from dependence. Medieval European physicians reading translated Avicenna found these observations validated by their own experience. The phenomenon was real, predictable, and largely untreatable with available medical knowledge. The signs of habituation were well documented. Patients needed progressively larger doses over time. They became anxious and difficult when opium wasn't available. They neglected other aspects of their lives in favor of ensuring opium supply. They experienced a specific constellation of physical symptoms when they tried to stop, including sweating, trembling, bodily aches, gastrointestinal distress, and profound insomnia. These symptoms resolved rapidly when opium was resumed, confirming that the substance itself was causing them rather than the original condition returning. Some medieval texts attempted to distinguish between physical dependence and what they called moral weakness. A patient who needed opium because stopping caused unbearable physical symptoms was viewed more sympathetically than one who sought opium for pleasure or to escape life's ordinary difficulties. But the line was blurry in practice. How could a physician distinguish genuine physical need from psychological craving? How could you tell if a patient claiming severe pain was suffering legitimately or seeking opium for other reasons? The reality was that medieval medicine had no good diagnostic tools for assessing these questions. Pain was subjective. Withdrawal symptoms were subjective. A determined patient could claim whatever symptoms would justify continued prescription. A suspicious physician could withhold opium from someone who genuinely needed it. The system was vulnerable to both manipulation by patients and cruelty by physicians, and examples of both existed. Arnold of Villanova, a prominent Spanish physician working in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, wrote about what he called the tyranny of opium. He described patients whose entire lives revolved around obtaining and consuming the substance, who would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure supply, who seemed to have lost freedom of choice regarding their consumption. His language suggested he understood this as a medical condition rather than simple moral failing, but he had no effective treatments to offer. He recommended gradual reduction of dose, supportive care, and prayer. None of these worked reliably. The moral dimensions troubled medieval thinkers profoundly. The Catholic Church taught that humans had free will, that sin resulted from choosing evil over good. But habitual opium users seemed to have lost this capacity for choice. They knew opium was harming them. They want to stop. They try to stop, but they couldn't, or at least couldn't sustain cessation for more than brief, miserable periods. Did this represent a failure of willpower, which would be sinful? Or was it a medical condition beyond the person's control, which would deserve compassion rather than judgment? Different theological thinkers reached different conclusions. Some argued that the initial choice to use opium excessively was sinful, and the resulting dependence was appropriate divine punishment. Others argued that dependence was a form of illness that afflicted the soul as well as the body, requiring medical and spiritual treatment without moral condemnation. These debates had practical consequences for how habituated patients were treated, whether they received continued medical care or were abandoned as moral failures. The phenomenon of fatal overdose, while different from habituation, revealed other dangers that medieval medicine observed but couldn't prevent reliably. Overdose could be accidental, the result of miscalculation or unusually potent opium. It could be intentional, suicide by opium being relatively quick and less violent than many alternatives. It could be criminal, opium being a murder weapon that could mimic natural death if administered cleverly. The signs of acute opium poisoning were well documented across multiple medical texts. The patient would become extremely drowsy, difficult or impossible to rouse. Breathing would slow, becoming shallow and irregular. The skin would turn pale or bluish. Pupils would constrict to pinpoints, a particularly distinctive sign. Body temperature would drop. Without intervention, breathing would eventually stop entirely and the patient would die. The progression could take hours or could be rapid depending on dose and individual sensitivity. Treatment recommendations existed, but were crude and often ineffective. If the overdose was caught immediately after ingestion, inducing vomiting could remove opium from the stomach before it was absorbed. Various substances were thought to counteract opium's effects, including vinegar, strong wine, certain herbs. Aggressive physical stimulation was recommended, keeping the patient moving and awake, pouring cold water over them, anything to prevent the descent into unconsciousness and respiratory failure. None of this worked reliably once deep poisoning had occurred. Medieval physicians watched helplessly as patients slipped away despite all interventions. Some survived massive overdoses seemingly by chance. Others died from amounts that should have been safe. The unpredictability was terrifying for both physicians and patients. Every dose carried theoretical risk, and there was no way to guarantee safety. Intentional overdose for suicide troubled medieval society, particularly because suicide was considered a grave sin that condemned the soul to hell. Families of suspected suicide victims sometimes pressured physicians to declare deaths accidental or due to natural causes, preventing the religious and social consequences of suicide. Physicians faced difficult decisions about how to certify these deaths, knowing their judgment affected not only the deceased's reputation, but their soul's fate according to Catholic teaching. Some medieval legal codes addressed opium-related deaths specifically. Poisoning with opium was recognized as murder, though proving it was difficult without witnesses. The symptoms of fatal overdose resembled natural death closely enough that clever poisoners could probably escape detection. Some texts provided guidance for distinguishing opium death from natural causes, looking for the characteristic pinpoint pupils, the distinctive smell, other subtle signs. But these were easily missed or misinterpreted. There are also documented cases of what we might now call harm reduction, though medieval medicine didn't use that term. Some physicians, recognizing that habituated patients couldn't stop using opium without suffering, focused instead on stabilizing their use at the lowest effective dose. The goal wasn't abstinence, but preventing escalation, keeping the patient functional rather than trying to cure a condition that seemed incurable. This pragmatic approach was controversial because it seemed to accept defeat, to abandon the patient to continued dependence. But for some physicians, it represented realistic acknowledgement of what was medically possible versus impossible. The wealthy had advantages in managing habituation that ordinary people lacked. They could afford consistent opium supply, avoiding forced withdrawal due to inability to purchase more. They could consult multiple physicians, seeking various opinions and treatments. They could reduce work obligations, allowing time to manage their dependence. Poor habituated users faced much grimmer prospects. When money ran out and opium became unaffordable, they had no choice but to endure withdrawal without medical support. Some probably died from complications of severe withdrawal, though this would have been recorded as death from unknown causes if recorded at all. The children of habituated parents represented a particularly troubling category that some medieval physicians recognized. If a mother used opium regularly during pregnancy, her infant might be born dependent, exhibiting withdrawal symptoms from birth. Medieval medicine didn't understand the mechanism, but clinical observation documented infants who were restless, who cried incessantly, who seemed distressed in ways that resolved when given small amounts of opium. This was horrifying to physicians who realized they were treating addiction in newborns. Some medieval texts specifically warned against giving opium to pregnant women or to infants and young children, though the practice continued because the immediate benefits seemed to outweigh poorly understood long-term risks. Opium quieted crying babies effectively, which must have been tempting for exhausted parents before the dangers were fully appreciated. The habit of giving infants opium to ease teething pain or to make them sleep was common enough that multiple medical authorities felt compelled to warn against it. There are scattered accounts of what might be called recovery, patients who successfully stopped using opium after extended dependence. These accounts describe the process as extremely difficult, requiring weeks of severe physical and psychological distress, but ultimately successful. Some patients apparently used religious devotion as support, spending the worst days in prayer and penance. Others had family support, people who could care for them during the period when they couldn't function independently. But recovery accounts are rare in the historical record, possibly because most attempts failed, possibly because successful cases weren't considered worthy of documentation. The physicians who dealt with habituation regularly often expressed frustration and helplessness. They had medicines that relieved suffering effectively, but created new suffering of a different kind. They had patients who begged for help escaping opium dependence, but couldn't tolerate the process of escape. They had theoretical knowledge about humors and drug effects, but no practical tools for managing addiction. The gap between understanding that a problem existed and being able to fix it was enormous and demoralizing. Some physicians restricted their opium prescribing in response to habituation concerns, using it only for dying patients or acute injuries, refusing to prescribe for chronic conditions regardless of patient suffering. This prevented habituation, but guaranteed that some patients experienced preventable suffering. Other physicians prescribed more liberally, prioritizing immediate relief over long-term consequences, accepting habituation as the price of pain management. Neither approach was clearly correct, and individual physicians agonized over where to draw lines. The medieval experience with opium dependence and overdose reveals a tragic pattern. A substance that was medically necessary for managing pain and other conditions carried inherent risks that couldn't be eliminated with available knowledge and technology. Physicians and patients made rational decisions to use opium, accepting known risks because the alternative was unacceptable suffering. But those rational individual decisions sometimes led to tragedy, to dependence that destroyed lives, to overdoses that ended them. Medieval medicine had identified the problem, understood it was serious, and had absolutely no solution beyond vague recommendations for willpower and gradual reduction that rarely worked in practice. Guillaume, the Parisian merchant with chronic back pain, represents countless medieval patients caught in this trap. He started using opium for legitimate medical reasons. His physician prescribed it appropriately. The initial results were positive, but the long-term consequence was a form of bondage that neither he nor his physician could break. He would likely spend the rest of his life dependent on an expensive substance that no longer provided much benefit, but whose absence caused unbearable distress. This was the price of pain relief in the medieval world, a price some patients paid willingly and others discovered too late they couldn't afford. The year is 1492, and a Swiss physician named Paracelsus is being born into a world that's about to change in ways nobody can predict. By the time he reaches adulthood, Columbus will have crossed the Atlantic. The printing press will have transformed how knowledge spreads. The Protestant Reformation will have shattered religious unity. And medicine, including the understanding and use of opium, will be entering a transformation that makes it recognizably different from what came before. The medieval period is ending, not cleanly or suddenly, but ending nonetheless. And opium's story is about to enter a new and ultimately more dangerous chapter. But before we move forward, we need to understand what the medieval period left behind. For roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome through the 15th century, European medicine had maintained a particular relationship with opium. It was expensive, which limited access. It was imported, which made supply unreliable. It was understood through humoral theory, which was scientifically wrong, but provided a working framework. It was used cautiously by most physicians, who respected its power and feared its dangers. This system had problems, serious ones, but it maintained certain constraints that would gradually disappear. The printing press, invented around 1440, began changing everything immediately. Medical texts that had existed in perhaps dozens of hand-copied manuscripts suddenly existed in hundreds or thousands of printed copies. Dioscorides became widely available. Galen became widely available. Avicenna, that towering figure of medieval Islamic medicine, became accessible to any European physician or apothecary who could afford a printed book, which was far cheaper than a hand-copied manuscript. Knowledge that had been concentrated in universities and monasteries spread outward. This democratization of knowledge had complex effects on opium use. More practitioners had access to information about proper dosing, about indications and contraindications, about the dangers of habituation and overdose. This should have improved safety, but it also meant that less trained practitioners, people without years of medical education, could learn enough from books to prescribe opium. The gatekeeping function that university-trained physicians had provided weakened. Knowledge spread faster than wisdom about how to apply it responsibly. Paracelsus himself embodied the transition from medieval to early modern medicine. He rejected humoral theory, the framework that had organized medical thinking for 2,000 years. He argued that diseases were specific entities with specific causes, not just humoral imbalances. He pioneered the use of chemical medicines, including mineral compounds that medieval physicians had avoided. And he developed laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol rather than wine, creating a standardized preparation that would dominate opium use for the next 3 centuries. Laudanum was more potent and reliable than medieval opium dissolved in wine. The alcohol extraction process captured opium's active components efficiently. The resulting tincture was easier to dose because it was liquid and could be measured precisely. Paracelsus promoted it aggressively, claiming it was vastly superior to theriac and other traditional preparations. He wasn't entirely wrong. Laudanum did work better than many medieval formulations, but it also made opium more accessible and easier to take regularly, lowering barriers that had previously constrained consumption. The age of exploration, beginning in the late 15th century, transformed opium supply in ways that would take generations to fully manifest. Portuguese explorers opened direct maritime routes to India and beyond, bypassing the overland trade networks that had moved opium from east to west for centuries. This didn't immediately make opium cheap, but it did make supply more reliable and less vulnerable to disruptions from wars or political upheavals in the Middle East. More significantly, European powers began recognizing opium's potential as a commodity for colonial trade. The Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the English, all became involved in the opium trade at scales that dwarfed medieval commerce. What had been a medical substance that also happened to be profitable became a profitable commodity that also happened to have medical uses. The shift was subtle at first, but would eventually lead to horrors that medieval physicians never imagined, including the deliberate promotion of opium addiction as colonial policy in places like China. Medical education was evolving as universities expanded and new medical schools emerged. The medieval apprenticeship model, where young physicians learned by working alongside experienced masters, gave way to more formal classroom instruction. Students learned from printed textbooks rather than rare manuscripts. They received more standardized training, though quality varied enormously between institutions. The rise of anatomical study, pioneered by Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century, began challenging ancient authorities and promoting direct observation over inherited wisdom. These changes affected opium use indirectly. As medicine became more empirical, less bound to ancient theory, physicians began observing and documenting opium's effects more systematically. They noticed patterns that medieval physicians had seen but hadn't fully articulated. They began thinking about dose-response relationships more carefully. They started recognizing that individual variation in response to opium was larger than ancient texts acknowledged. This empirical turn was scientifically productive, but didn't immediately improve safety because the underlying pharmacology remained mysterious. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517 when Martin Luther posted his theses, fractured European religious unity and had unexpected effects on medicine. In Protestant regions, the Catholic Church's authority over medical practice weakened. Secular physicians gained more autonomy. The moral framework that had constrained medieval opium use, the concern about sinful indulgence and consciousness alteration, shifted. Different Protestant denominations developed their own positions on medical pain relief and the use of substances that altered consciousness, but the unified Catholic perspective no longer dominated. This religious fragmentation probably made opium slightly more accessible in Protestant regions, though the effect was subtle and varied by location. What mattered more was the broader cultural shift toward individual conscience and away from institutional authority. Patients felt more empowered to make their own medical decisions. Physicians felt less constrained by religious authorities telling them what was spiritually appropriate. The result was a slight loosening of the cautious approach that had characterized much medieval practice. Literature began reflecting opium's presence in European culture in new ways. Medieval literature had rarely mentioned opium explicitly. Early modern writers referenced it more frequently, usually in context of pain relief or healing, but occasionally acknowledging its consciousness-altering properties. The substance was becoming more culturally visible, no longer confined to medical texts and pharmacy shops, but entering broader awareness as something powerful and potentially dangerous. By the 17th century, opium use in Europe had increased substantially compared to medieval levels. This wasn't yet the explosion that would come in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it was significant. More physicians prescribed it. More apothecaries stocked it. More patients had access to it, at least among classes that could afford medical care. The constraints that had limited medieval use, high cost, unreliable supply, cautious medical culture, were all weakening simultaneously. Thomas Sydenham, an English physician working in the mid to late 17th century, perfected laudanum formulations and promoted opium use enthusiastically. He called opium a gift from God, declared it the most useful medicine available to physicians, and prescribed it for an enormous range of conditions. His influence was enormous. Medical students across Europe learned from his texts. His version of laudanum, Sydenham's laudanum, became the standard preparation, and his enthusiastic promotion helped normalize opium use in ways that would have made medieval physicians deeply uncomfortable. Sydenham wasn't reckless. He understood opium's dangers and warned about them. But his overall message was that the benefits vastly outweighed the risks for most patients, that opium should be used more widely rather than hoarded for only the most desperate cases. This represented a significant shift from medieval caution. The medieval physician saw opium as dangerous medicine to be used sparingly. The early modern physician increasingly saw it as valuable medicine to be used liberally. Both perspectives had some validity, but the shift had consequences. By the 18th century, opium use in Europe, and increasingly in European colonies, had reached levels that would have shocked medieval observers. Laudanum was available in apothecary shops, sometimes with minimal oversight. Patent medicines containing opium proliferated, marketed directly to consumers for everything from infant teething pain to adult insomnia. The medical gatekeeping that had characterized medieval practice had largely collapsed. Anyone with money could purchase opium preparations, and many did. The consequences manifested gradually, but inexorably. Addiction rates increased. Overdose deaths increased. Social problems associated with opium use became more visible. The substance that medieval physicians had treated with cautious respect became, in the hands of early modern and then modern medicine, a source of epidemic suffering. The 19th century would see opium addiction reach crisis levels in Europe and America. The 20th century would see the development of even more potent opioids and even worse crises. Looking back at the medieval period from our current vantage point reveals something important. Medieval medicine's approach to opium, for all its flaws and limitations, maintained a relationship with the substance that was arguably healthier than what followed. The expense and scarcity that frustrated medieval physicians also prevented widespread addiction. The cautious prescribing culture that sometimes let patients suffer unnecessarily also prevented many cases of habituation. The gatekeeping by educated physicians, while creating inequitable access, also provided some protection against misuse. This isn't to romanticize medieval medicine. People suffered horribly from inadequate pain relief. Access was deeply unfair, determined by wealth and geography rather than need. The theoretical frameworks were wrong. The dosing was imprecise and dangerous. Many patients who could have been helped weren't, because opium was unavailable or unaffordable. The medieval approach had serious problems that caused real suffering. But the problems of medieval opium use were primarily problems of scarcity and insufficient access. The problems of modern opioid use are primarily problems of abundance and excessive access. Medieval patients often couldn't get relief they needed. Modern patients often get relief they don't need, or get it too easily, or become dependent before realizing the danger. Both situations cause suffering, but the mechanisms are nearly opposite. The transformation from medieval scarcity to modern abundance happened gradually over centuries, driven by technological change, commercial expansion, evolving medical culture, and countless individual decisions by physicians, patients, merchants, and policymakers. No single person or moment caused the shift. It was a cumulative process where small changes accumulated into fundamental transformation. Understanding this history reveals that the relationship between a society and powerful medicines is never fixed. It evolves based on technology, economics, culture, and knowledge. Medieval Europe had one relationship with opium, shaped by its limitations and assumptions. Early modern Europe developed a different relationship. Modern societies have developed yet another, shaped by our own circumstances and choices. The medieval physician standing at a patient's bedside with limited opium supply, trying to decide whether this suffering justified using the precious medicine, faced genuine moral and practical dilemmas. So, does the modern physician with a prescription pad, trying to decide whether to prescribe opioids to a patient requesting them for chronic pain, knowing the statistics about addiction and overdose? The specific circumstances differ enormously, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you balance relief of suffering against risk of harm? How do you make decisions without perfect information? How do you honor both your obligation to reduce pain and your obligation to prevent addiction? Medieval physicians never solved these problems. They couldn't, because the problems don't have permanent solutions. They have only temporarily adequate compromises that shift as circumstances change. The medieval compromise, expensive scarce medicine, carefully rationed by educated gatekeepers, worked tolerably within medieval constraints. It broke down as those constraints disappeared. The modern compromise, abundant medicine regulated by prescription requirements and monitoring systems, works tolerably within modern constraints. It's breaking down as overprescribing leads to addiction epidemics. Future societies will need to develop new compromises suited to their circumstances, and those compromises will eventually break down too, requiring new adaptations in an endless cycle of problem and response. What the medieval period teaches us isn't that their approach was better than ours. It wasn't in most respects. It teaches us that managing powerful medicines requires wisdom beyond just technical knowledge, that access and restriction both cause problems, that every system for balancing relief and risk has costs, and that those costs fall unevenly on different people. Medieval peasants who suffered without relief paid one kind of cost. Modern addiction victims pay another. Both are real human suffering caused by systemic limitations. The forgotten medieval painkiller that eased suffering for some, while remaining cruelly inaccessible to others, that created dependence in some users while helping many more, that killed through overdose, but also prevented death from pain-induced shock. That substance was both medicine and poison, depending on circumstances. It still is. The technology has changed. The potency has increased. The access has expanded. But the fundamental nature of opioids, powerful tools for relief that carry serious risks, remains constant across centuries. Medieval physicians knew this. They lived with the tension daily. They made imperfect decisions, trying to balance competing goods and harms. So do modern physicians. So will future physicians working with medicines we haven't imagined yet. The specific challenges change, but the underlying dilemma of managing suffering with dangerous tools persists across time. That's what the history of opium in the Middle Ages ultimately reveals. Not a lost golden age or a primitive past we've surpassed, but humans struggling with problems that remain fundamentally unsolved.